This is the Voyage Report podcast, where you get the scoop on travel. Now, the editor-in-chief of the Voyage Report, Mark Albert.
Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome. If today's podcast doesn't inspire you, I'm not sure what will. Our guest just set a world record, and it took a lot of time, energy, and some money to make it happen. Eric T. Nguyen has just become the youngest person to visit every country around the globe, nearly 200 of them. Eric joins us today via Skype from his home near San Francisco. Eric, welcome to the Voyage Report podcast.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for having me today. How are you today?
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait to talk about all that you've accomplished. Now, you just set this record in May, right? And you were 24 years and 175 days old. I guess you were really counting, right? The days matter.
175 days, correct.
And the days matter because you were trying to beat somebody at their own record.
Correct. Well, when I first started to travel, I wasn't chasing any records. But it just so happened that there was a point when I was getting close to breaking this world record of becoming the youngest person to visit every country, and I decided to go for it.
Well, of course. I mean, if you were that close, why not? So let me just ask you some questions that we ask all our guests, if that's all right. First of all, what was your biggest discovery while traveling? This could be an inner truth, a food, someplace you really liked. What did you discover while you were on the road for that long?
Well, what I really loved about traveling is that I feel like it really helps you see life from other people's perspective and stuff. And having visited every country, or every UN-recognized country at least, you really get to see what life is like from their perspective. For example, you always read about, say, starving children in Africa, but it brings a whole new perspective when you actually see them in person and stuff.
Oh, I can only imagine. What was the favorite place that you went to?
That's also a really tough question because traveling's kind of like a wave. So it goes up and it goes down. So I actually had quite a few places I liked. It would be quite hard to name a favorite place because there are quite a few places that I did enjoy in this world. And it's quite a oftenly asked question. So
I bet, and yet you haven't picked one yet. You don't want to alienate any of the countries, right, in case you go back?
Exactly. I don't want to alienate every country, plus, I feel like when traveling, each person can have a totally different experience in each country and stuff. And that would be like a bit biased to say what's my favorite country, what's my least favorite country, because it will all depend on the experiences that I've had in each country. And someone else could go to the same country and have a totally different experience.
Well, we'll give you a couple minutes here as we're talking to think about it. Maybe I'll phrase the question a little bit differently later on. I'll ask you maybe the country that you were most surprised with. We'll talk about it here in a little bit later in the podcast. So what's the next place that you're traveling to? I mean, once you've gone to, 196, 197 countries, what's left?
198, correct.
198.
Well, I'm planning to go to Antarctica, which is not an official country, but I'm planning to go to Antarctica this winter, and I'm also planning to go to Vietnam in a few weeks.
Oh my goodness! Can you take me with you to Antarctica? I mean, I'll carry your bags. I'll make your dinner, whatever you need. I mean, that's just a wonderful place. And then you would be able to say that you've been to all 7 continents.
Exactly. So every country, but only 6 continents so far.
Now, you said you're going to Vietnam in a couple of weeks. Your parents are Vietnamese refugees, right?
Correct. They are refugees from Vietnam. My mom came here in 1975 following the end of the Vietnam War, and my dad came here as a boat refugee in 1980.
Wow. And how has that informed your experience or your travel? I mean, how does that inform how you see the world and how you travel?
Well, I grew up in quite a different environment from my parents, of course, because they grew up in the middle of the Vietnam War, and they experienced all types of hardships growing up, seeing their friends and family perish in the war. Whereas I grew up in the SF Bay Area, pretty much sheltered from all the dangerous stuff that happened in the war, and I was fortunate that I didn't have to deal with the hunger or famines or having to see any of my friends die when I grew up. So it was quite a different experience for me growing up, of course. My parents did try quite hard to shelter me from what they experienced growing up. It was really tough for them to grow up in that situation in the Vietnam War.
Absolutely, I can imagine. Now, you wanted to complete this quest once you found out about this record. I mean, what made you deep inside want to visit every country in the first place?
Well, ever since I was young, say 5 or 6, I've always had a fascination with traveling like around the whole world. I grew up in a small valley just outside of San Francisco, and there's about 20,000 people in the area I was living in. So we were quite isolated, I guess you could say that. And it's always, I've always had like, I've always wanted to travel the whole world outside of course, the SF Bay Area, because even though many people claim that the Bay Area is a nice place, and it is a really nice place, but I've always wanted to see what's beyond like this little environment that I grew up in and lived almost my whole life in. My parents did take me on a bunch of vacations when I was growing up, and pretty much like every few months we would be going somewhere like New York City, or I went to Mexico, which was my first trip abroad when I was 3. We headed to some countries in the Caribbean when I was 5. Went to Europe and visited a few countries in the summer when I was 9 years old, and then I went to Asia for the first time when I was 10.
You and I, Eric, share this innate curiosity about the world. You simply have done it a lot faster than I have, even though I'm older than you. But I would love to visit every country. I mean, I just think there are so many different people and cultures and landscapes and countries out there, and there's just so little time and so little money, and I want to get to all of them. So I salute you for your accomplishment. Let's talk about that time and money. How long did it take you to accomplish this, and how much did it cost?
Okay, well, first, before I get to that, I would like to say that, well, there's still a lot more for me to see out there than just like, even though I have visited every country, there's still so many parts of every country that I would still like to visit. For example, Russia is one country, but I still want to visit Siberia and the Kamchatka Peninsula and, of course, the Lake Baikal and stuff. So even though I have visited every country, I feel like this is just the beginning of the journey, and that there's still so many places that I can still visit in this world, despite having visited every country already.
That's your next goal. I salute you for that as well. So how long did this take for you to get to 198 countries, and what did it cost?
Okay, so in terms of time, I visited a few of these countries with my parents, of course. Me and my mom and dad, before I turned 18, I went to visit about 17 countries. And then the summer I turned 18, I went abroad to Asia for about 3 months during my first year of university. And that was my first real backpacking trip, and I visited quite a few countries. And ever since there, I'm just like, I just want to keep traveling and stuff. And at that point, I just wanted to see more. I had no idea about any records or anything. I just have had like a long, deep passion for traveling and stuff. And that's how like I would start traveling in my university years. For example, during like spring break or winter break or summer break, or every opportunity that I could travel, I would travel. And I guess my first like big trip was I took a year off in university between my third year and my last year of undergraduate, and I traveled the world for a year then, and then I traveled for 2 more years after I graduated, and so that would make 3 years, and of course all the times that I took breaks off and the times that I traveled with my parents. So 3.5 to 4 years in cumulative time, I would say.
Right, for really intensive travel. But if I'm right, let's see, you said you went to Mexico when you were 3, you broke the record at 24, so spanning over 21 years or so.
Exactly.
What did this all cost? Have you ever added it up?
I would estimate it around, well, because I couch surf a lot, and couch surfing is this website where you can stay with local people and experience the local culture, the local cuisine, and they're really helpful at giving advice and stuff. So that really did help me save a lot in accommodation. I met a lot of amazing people on my journey through couch surfing. You have heard of it, correct?
Yeah, and I think you pay, what, $20 a year, right?
That's only if you get membership, but
right,
for
the
now,
membership, yeah.
But if you host a few people, then your membership is free, and you can couch surf as much as you want.
Fantastic, and of course that's free to you as the couch surfer.
Yeah, exactly. And and I always try to do stuff over land because, of course, flying everywhere is quite expensive. So in order to fit my budget, I did a lot of overlanding, and I also couch surfed a lot. So I would say, not including the travels with my parents, I would say I spent about $70,000 or $75,000 on the whole trip.
Wow, $70,000. It sounds like a lot, but of course, when you divide that by 198 and all the days and the years that you spent doing it, I mean, divided by 3 or 4 years, that is much more manageable than what many people would spend just going through their daily lives.
Exactly. Like I try to live like a local pretty much. Of course, at some places like it was hard to fit in like a local, but I would try to fit in like a local if I could, like say like an expat who moved to the country and stuff, because
Right.
it's a lot more manageable than if you stay in hotels all the time, of course.
Absolutely. No five-star Waldorf Astoria, I would imagine. How many passports did you go through?
I covered 6 passports, all U.S. passports.
Six passports. My goodness. And so you have to, I
Correct.
mean, normally they're good for 10 years, but clearly you had to get a little bit more. And now they don't allow
Of
extra
course.
pages. So were you to try
Exactly.
to do the journey now, you'd have to do even more.
Well, yes. Actually, I went through the last few passports in the last 2 years, and it was kind of a bummer that they removed the extra pages because that meant I had to get stuck in like certain countries for a while. Because when you're abroad, it takes them about over a month just to process a new passport.
And listeners, if you want to know more about passports and why the State Department stopped doing the extra pages, you can listen to podcast 15 in iTunes or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. We talked to a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, the woman who's in charge of passports, and she's got all your answers on that one. Um,
Mhm.
what about tennis shoes? How many pairs of shoes did you go through? I would imagine it's a lot. I mean, you said you went overland a lot, and you probably had to replace them a few times.
I probably did have to replace them a few times. I didn't really keep track of how many shoes I went through, but I would say maybe a dozen, probably a dozen.
Oh my goodness. Now, let's ask the question that I know a lot of our listeners right now are wondering. Were you scared at any point? I heard or I read somewhere that you were almost kidnapped in Libya, had a gun pointed to your head in Liberia. You were robbed a couple of times.
That's all correct. Well, in the beginning, my first scary experience was when I was walking down an alleyway in China during my in Beijing. No, no, it was Shanghai in my first trip, and there were these guys with knives who tried to, I guess, mug me and stuff.
Oh
And
my gosh.
I was just really scared, so I ran off, not knowing if they were going to stab me or something. And I managed to run out of the situation. I didn't dare to look back to see if they were chasing me or anything. So that was my first scary experience. But that didn't really deter me from traveling. It just I feel like when you actually travel, there are some dangerous circumstances. But overall, I think that I found that people were much friendlier than I guess what most people would imagine when they go to foreign countries and stuff.
Obviously, probably not as friendly as you would hoped when they pointed a gun at you in,
Oh, of
was
course
it
not.
Liberia? Yeah.
It was in like Monrovia, Liberia. Yeah, I was sleeping at my couch surfing host house, and we were sleeping at around 7:30. This guy came in and he pointed a gun straight at my face, and I was just like, well, a lot of stuff had already happened prior to the gun incident in Monrovia. So at this point, I figured I just tried to like bluff my way out, and I figured like if he's gonna shoot me, he's gonna shoot me anyways. And I had gotten robbed at a hospital a couple weeks before in Liberia when I caught malaria and stuff, and I was just really sick of like it was a really tough time for me. So I just try to bluff, and I'm just saying like, hey, you're my friend or something. Like we're like I'm American, you're Liberian. We can be friends. You don't have to do this. If you want, I can go to the bank and withdraw money. Like, of course, I was totally bluffing and stuff, but I realized that he may have shot me either way, So at least it was just something I had to think like straight off. I don't know if it was the best bluff, but he fell for it and he went off after I bluffed. I didn't have anything with me.
Oh my goodness. And then you just mentioned that you had malaria. I mean, there must have been some really tough times during this journey.
There were some tough times. So the toughest time in my journey was this 1 month period in the summer of 2016, which was last summer, and I was in West Africa overlanding it. And I remember when we were going overland. So they have these like shared taxis. They don't really have buses in Western Africa for transportation. So they would have like these shared taxis where people would tie your luggage up at the top, and so it would be like 2 meters above the car, and they try to fit as many people as they could in one of these shared taxis. So we had like 11 people or something in this shared taxi and stuff. And the way that they would when we stopped for like dinner, for example, because it was a really long ride, everyone would share one big plate of like rice or whatever, or rice and meat. And the thing that I noticed with this trip is that they all used their hands to grab in it, and with the soup they also would grab into the food with their hand and they would lick it, and dip it back into the soup, and then they would offer it to me, which at that point I
Wow.
felt I felt like I kind of lost my appetite.
I
So,
think every health professional that is listening to this podcast is sort of grossed out right now. I know
but
for
it's a reality in these countries, like.
right.
And then after that, this is when I was going from Guinea-Bissau to Guinea. Our taxi broke down in the middle of the jungle, and so we were stuck there for 3 days. And I had to sleep on top of the taxi, on top of all the luggage that they put on top of the taxi because,
Oh,
well, the local people they didn't want to, of course, share any room for me. So I ended up sleeping
right.
on top of the taxi, and it started raining in the middle of the night. I got bitten by a lot of mosquitoes, and that's how I ended up getting malaria a few weeks later. It was definitely a tough time. We finally got out of there when there was another shared taxi that came by, and they offered to put me into the hood, like the trunk of the car, in exchange for some money, of course. Because pretty much in West Africa, if you have like at least some cash with you, you'll be able to get anywhere with a bit of luck, of course. And I ended up in Conakry, and I got into this really bad motorcycle accident. My couchsurfing host, he was super excited to show me around Conakry and stuff. So he was driving super fast down to wherever we were going, and this taxi in front of us just stopped. And so my host tried to stop his motorcycle, but he didn't stop it in time. So he went crashing into the taxi, and I guess the motorcycle kind of flipped. So I went flying over the taxi, and I bumped my head on
Oh
the
my
concrete.
gosh.
And then my couchsurfing host ended up falling on top of me, and my laptop got snapped in half, and that was not fun at all.
Oh,
Of course, the healthcare wasn't too great here, so of course I just crossed my fingers, hope I wasn't gonna die or anything. I ended up with like these two huge bumps on my head. And then a couple weeks later, I caught malaria when I was in Liberia. So I was knocked out for a few days, and then I unfortunately discovered that I also got someone stole my bag with all my cash in it, which was kind of a bummer when I was in Liberia. So that whole month stretch from the car accident and everything breaking down, me getting malaria, getting robbed, and having a gun pointed in my head, it was a pretty crazy month. And I don't think it would happen to most travelers because I went overland and I also couch surfed with people who stayed in the more slummy parts of town, I guess. So I guess I was putting myself in a bit more danger than if you were to stay in a nice hotel with hotel guards and stuff.
so during this month, especially, did you ever consider ending your journey and going home? I mean, once somebody points a gun at you or you get malaria, a lot of people might say, you know what, I'm getting on the next flight home and I'm out of here. Did that ever cross your mind?
My parents really wanted me to go home because throughout this whole trip, I've run into quite a few dangerous situations. And my mom and my dad were just like, Eric, just go home. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, all the stuff that you go through just to try to visit every country. But I think, like, deep inside me, I still wanted to continue, even though the journey was tough. And at some points, it was really heartbreaking and stuff. But the thing about me, I just hate to give up on stuff. So I I did rest for a couple weeks to get better from the malaria, and then I pushed on. Although it was really difficult, I will give the situation that.
When you say heartbreaking, did you mean tough because of the incidents that we talked about, or was there also some loneliness or some homesickness?
I did feel well both because I also felt I missed my mom and my sister a lot, especially when I traveled for so many years, like without getting to see them too much. And I also met so many amazing people in my journey. And I guess the toughest thing was having to say bye to all the people that I meet and having to miss somebody from like different parts of the world with the fact that it was just tough to get to see everyone all at once. Like there was always somebody that I missed in some part of the world. And it was, in terms of that, that was also quite tough. And missing my friends and sacrificing all that time to travel to visit every country.
So there were clearly some sacrifices there, and also I think that you had deferred the start of medical school. Is that right, to do this journey?
That's correct, yes. Um, so I can get into the story about that. About before I started my journey in the right after I graduated, I had a decision to make, and it was between either going straight to medical school or going to travel and accomplish this record. So the person that I talked to was my molecular biology professor, Dr. Enoch Baldwin, and I asked him, "Hey, professor, do you think that I should go straight to medical school, or if I should go on this journey and try to chase and break that record?" Of course, we talked about this topic for a couple hours, and the gist of it is that he pretty much told me that, "Listen, Eric, I've always wanted to travel the world, and I always told myself that I'd do it later after I finished like getting my career ready and stuff. But the fact was that my professor's in his 60s now, and he's still teaching full time, and he used to work as a doctor, and now he has 4 kids that he has to take care of. So he never had the time to travel like he wanted to. So he told me that if it was the time to travel is now, when I'm still young and stuff, instead of waiting forever. And I also saw that with my parents, and that they've always wanted to travel the whole world, but they're work for full time. So it has been tough for them to travel like they wish. And they said they'll travel when they're 65 or whatever. But I see it's kind of tough to travel in Africa like this when you're 65.
So, boy, I bet you wish you had had that medical training from medical school when you got malaria. I mean, how did you deal with that?
Well, I pretty much crossed my fingers. I went to the American hospital, or the JFK hospital in Monrovia, and pretty much just got treatment and crossed my fingers for the best. Of course, it would be a lot tougher to fly back to the US and then fly back to Africa. So at that point, I took as much medication or as I pretty much took a bunch of malaria pills and medication to treat it. Of course, malaria doesn't fully go away, but I tried my best to take as much treatment as I could before continuing my journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a challenging journey even when you're healthy, I would imagine, let alone when you have something like malaria. So we've talked about some of the lowlights or some of the incidents along the way. What about the highlights? I mean, what were some of the times that you had that you just sort of had to stop and take your breath in and think, this is amazing?
Some of my favorite places to go, for example, I really loved Japan a lot, and that I found the people were quite hospitable. When I was in Tokyo, this was during my first backpacking trip back in 2011 when I was 18. And me and my friend got lost on our way back to our hotel. And at that point, I didn't have an iPhone or anything or GPS like I do now. And we asked a bunch of locals the way back to our hotel. And they were actually really hospitable. They walked us all the way back to our hotel, which is like an hour out of the way. And
wow.
I don't think that in the U.S. if you just ask for someone for help, either they don't help you really. They're just like, it's that way, and then they try to like go off somewhere. Whereas in certain countries, people are really eager to help you out when you're in a lost situation and stuff. And what I noticed that when I traveled to Japan or other countries is that, well, not Japan so much, but to certain countries, is that people are really friendly. Like you can say hi to strangers on the street, or you can say just hi to random people, start up a conversation with a random stranger. And people are really nice, and everybody knows their neighbors and stuff. Whereas in San Francisco or major cities in the US, you don't really go around waving to random people, or else they kind of look at you like, hey, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he waving to us? Do I know that guy? Like, he must be like crazy or something. Not so much in, like, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas especially what I noticed in third world countries is that people are really friendly to strangers. Whereas in major cities like New York City, where I grew up, San Francisco, like, you don't really get to know your neighbors at all. I don't even know my next door neighbor right now, which I think is kind of sad, but that's how it is in the SF Bay Area. Everyone's more to themselves, I guess.
Now, I said in the beginning of the podcast that I was going to ask you this a little bit later, so I'm wondering what surprised you the most. I mean, when you were in a country, was there any country where you had expectations going in, and then once you were there, you were totally surprised that it was completely different?
I would have to say Syria was one that really surprised me.
Wow.
I mean, of all the stuff that we hear in the media, like the place is getting blown to bits and stuff, there were some areas in Syria when I was in Syria that were blown up to bits, but there were also many areas that were very, they were living a normal life, and other than the occasional like bomb every other hour and stuff. It didn't really bother the people that much, especially in Damascus or Western Aleppo, where, of course, like there are flashes of lights and bombs once in a while, but the people still lived their normal life and they were still quite happy or content with their life, I should say, despite what's happening to their country right now. And it was interesting to see they were still so friendly towards foreigners and they were still so positive about life, despite the fact that their country's on a full war right now.
I would imagine they don't see very many foreigners.
Uh-huh. But they were very friendly and they were much more positive than I would have expected for a country that's in the middle of a war. And
Listeners, we're going to be asking Eric here in a bit for his tips for travelers, both those who are frequent travelers and those who are infrequent. Everything that he's learned over these 198 countries. We'll see what kind of tips he has to share with you for travelers of all stripes. Eric, our listeners will know that I kind of have the philosophy when I travel that I don't like to over-plan. I like to sort of go somewhere and let the wind take me where it will. And if there's a great-looking street or building, I want to go there. I don't want to be rigid and, take a group tour for 10 hours everywhere and sort of be strapped into an itinerary. How do you travel? When you know that you're going to be going to a new country that you've never been, how do you approach that? What kind of research do you do, or how do you like to plan your trip?
well, I agree with you in what you just said, because especially when you travel in Africa or other countries, it's sometimes impossible to plan because you never know what's going to happen in that country the next day. For example, they may close the border, or some countries will close their airports the day of, and it's difficult to plan in some parts of the world. So I would just say, like, go with the wind and see what happens and see where it takes you.
And I think a lot of the frequent travelers that I talk to think that way as well. Listeners, our podcast number 9, we had a 27-year-old Globetrotter, Henrik Jeppersen, who had been to every country. And, Eric, he had the same philosophy that we've just been talking about here, where you sort of have to have some flexibility and let fate kind of take you where it will.
Exactly. I totally agree. Actually, I heard about Henrik. I was staying with a friend in Denmark, in Copenhagen. His name was Jacob Oster, and he was the one who also interviewed Henrik Travels for his journey around the world. Henrik is from Denmark, I believe, and he was one of the few Danish people to travel to every country. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, he told us on the podcast that now that he's accomplished every country, he wants to go to every territory, every semi-autonomous territory. And I think my memory's a little fuzzy here, but I think he said maybe about 60 or so of them around the world. You mentioned a moment ago that you do want to go to some territories, right?
Correct. I still want to visit every territory on the TCC list. So in terms of country, there's 196, 97, 198, depending on how you look at it. In terms of territories, there's 325 territories. So I've covered about 260 territories. And when I have time, I want to visit the rest of them. Of course, for this goal, I'm not planning to be the youngest one to visit every territory, just because I want to enjoy each territory more rather than. I felt like even in this most recent world trip to visit every country, it was a little bit rushed, and I would like to spend more time in each territory and stuff and fully experience what it's like in each territory in the world.
Yes, maybe the youngest record has escaped your grasp. I mean, now you're getting really old. Now you're almost 25. My goodness.
Well, I think the youngest person on the TCC list, if I'm not mistaken, would be 36. So I still have 60 territories, over a decade, but I'm not planning to set any youngest TCC list traveler or anything.
So before we get to tips for travelers, I'm curious what's next. You had deferred medical school. Is that what you're doing right now, or is that what you're going to pick up?
Yes, I'm planning to take the MCAT, take some online courses. Originally, I wanted to move to Vietnam and then take online MCAT courses with the Princeton Review. But my parents do miss me a lot, and my family does want me to stay back in the Bay Area. So I'm a little bit undecided on what to do now, whether I should stay home with my parents and spend some quality time with my family, because for the last 7 years, 3 of those years I was traveling abroad, and the other 4 years I was in university. So I haven't really had the chance to see my family and my little sister too much. So I'm still deciding on where I want to study for the MCAT right now, and the plan is to just travel a little bit more, go to Antarctica, of course, in the winter, but then again, apply for the next cycle to go into medical school.
And so how are you going to use this experience in the future? How do you take an amazing record-setting trip like this and translate that into something
A career.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've always wanted to work and travel at the same time. And I was thinking I could probably either go into Doctors Without Borders or practice as a doctor in the South Pole or something, or somewhere unique. Because I've always had a huge passion for traveling, but I've also wanted to assist. My family's been in the medical profession for pretty much like generations. So I've also wanted to help people out in terms of like giving them medical aid and everything. So I'm looking to find a way where I can still become a doctor, but still work abroad and travel or live abroad.
So it sounds like at some point in your life you want to give back and help other people.
Of course, of course. I've been pretty fortunate in this journey in that I've had a lot of useful advice that's helped me navigate through the countries and stuff.
What was the best piece of advice that you got when you were on the road from someone that you hadn't known, that you were in a country that you just met, and they gave you some advice?
Well, I was traveling in Tanzania, and that's when my iPhone and my electronics were stolen from me. And that pretty much kind of messed up my schedule a bit, in that without my electronics, it would be I would have to rearrange like my schedule and stuff, because then I didn't have I was in the kind of like the more isolated areas of Tanzania, and without my phone and stuff, I didn't have any 3G, and that's when I had to reschedule my trip and set aside extra budgets and stuff. And I met this Finnish, I think they were Swedish or Finnish, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly. And they just told me like, hey, listen, Eric, sometimes devastating stuff does happen when you travel, but you just have to like, maybe it's just a way to like explore a different path and see what the new path reveals to you and stuff. And because of that, I stayed in I met some locals in the neighboring country of Malawi, and I stayed with them for a week, and they were some of the nicest people that I've ever met. And they gave me some really nice advice. So if it wasn't for that, pretty much everything that happens in the journey, I guess, happens for a reason, and you end up seeing something else, and learn something from the experience.
Exactly. Well said. All right, let's get our listeners some travel tips here. First, let's start with the frequent traveler. Obviously, not 198 countries frequent, but for those who may travel once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year or more, and are familiar with overseas travel, what are some tips for them? And then we'll ask you about those who never travel overseas.
Okay, well, I guess the first tip would be something that you actually told me yourself, and that it's really tough to have like a strict schedule and stuff. So if something unexpected happens, then just go with the flow and see what it brings you. My advice is that try not to plan too hard for something to happen, in case, because when you travel, a lot of unexpected things happen, and you might have to change your schedule at the last minute. Also, it's good to have some emergency cash just in case, like in my experience, I got robbed a few times or encountered some dilemmas that I had to have some extra cash to get out of the situation. And it's always good to budget more than what you plan to have, because, of course, if something happens and you're planning to stick with this rigid schedule, it would be a lot tougher without some safety cash, I guess I would call it.
No, that's an absolutely good point. In fact, the only country I've ever been to so far, and I've only been to 55, but the only country I've been to so far where I actually didn't need any cash, and I don't know if you found this, Eric, but was Iceland. And I think it was 2008 or 2009, so it's not even that recent. And I remember we went with a buddy and we did a road trip through Iceland. It was about 6 days on the ring road there. And I remember that even the old lady on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere with a cart selling vegetables, she would take your credit card. I mean, it was just amazing. We never used currency at all. But I definitely agree with you. I think having cash is one of those universal languages that will help open doors for you if you need it. Now, what about for our listeners who are infrequent travelers? Maybe they haven't been overseas ever. Maybe they are just getting their passport and looking to go somewhere, or maybe they just go once every couple of years. What are your tips for the infrequent traveler who may be a little bit intimidated about travel?
Well, as I like to say, oftentimes people are afraid of what they don't know. And I figure that from my experience, when you actually get to travel and stuff, the world's a lot less scary place than you would imagine it to be. Even though I've had some pretty scary experiences, I found that compared to what the media likes to say about the world's a lot friendlier than if you approach it with like an open mind and you realize like, hey, not everyone's out to get you. It's not a complete nightmare in this world, and people are actually very friendly. Um, I mean, every single person in this world has like a mother, or brother, or sister, or grandparents, or of course a family, and so we're all more similar than we think we are. I think humanity likes to divide people into like different like categories and stuff. But what I've noticed that when I've traveled is that having been to every country is that we're all kind of similar in some aspect, and people are quite friendly if you're open to them. Of course, there are times you have to be careful, but it's less scary than you think it is.
And for those listeners here who may be truly inspired by what you've been able to accomplish, would you recommend doing this type of quest for people who love travel and who want to do it? Would you recommend trying to get to every country in the world?
I would recommend it. I feel like it's a good learning experience. You get to really learn about what it's like to be in someone else's shoes and stuff. I guess the best way to put it is that when you see something, you understand it from a different light compared to if you just read it off a book. For example, I'll bring up, have you read Harry Potter, for example?
I've seen the movies. I haven't read the books.
Okay. So, for example, Lord Voldemort is supposed to be the most evil person in the plot. But because many people can't really relate to some evil sorcerer killing children, whereas with Professor Umbridge, you have that mean professor, and a lot of people can relate to like that evil professor who like tries to like torture or humiliate you in some way or just doesn't like you and stuff. And I feel like more people are able to relate with Harry's hatred for his professor rather than his fear for Lord Voldemort, just because they've been in a similar situation as Harry when it comes to, there's a professor that really doesn't like me or that I don't like, compared to, oh no, there's some evil guy trying to kill all of us. Like that doesn't happen too much in life. So people can relate to situations that they've been in rather than say some fantasy where, well, in this case, Lord Voldemort tries to kill random children.
Listeners, you can look at Eric's journey on Facebook at ENGUYEN1122, Eric, Nguyen1122, and on Instagram at Eric Nguyen Travels, ERICNGUYEN Travels, and you can follow him on social media. Eric, thank you so much for joining us on the Voyage Report podcast, and congratulations on being the youngest person to visit every country around the globe. What an accomplishment.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for having me, Mark.
Listeners, what do you think about Eric's world record? Would you want to visit every country in the world? I know I do. Are you on a similar journey right now? Let us know by rating this podcast, giving us a review, and sharing it on social media. We have guests every week talking about travel news and trends, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast. We'd sure appreciate your review. It helps bring more awareness to our journalism and original content. And if you have an idea for a future guest on our podcast, please reach out at voyagereport.com and let us know. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Albert. Bon voyage.
You've been listening to the Voyage Report podcast. Get the scoop on travel at voyagereport.com.